Hello, everyone. I'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to join, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started, and hopefully I can still see the participant numbers rising, so hopefully people will be able to join us as we go. Welcome to this webinar, which is jointly hosted by Pasture-Fed Livestock Association and Plantlife. I'm Honor Eldridge, I'm the policy lead at Plantlife. Some of you might be a little surprised to see me. My colleague Jenny Hawley was meant to be hosting tonight, but she's had a family emergency, and so I have stepped in on her behalf. It's definitely Jenny's area of expertise, but hopefully I'll be able to muddle my way through with the best of intentions, but hopefully you can all bear with me if I do get something a little bit wrong. But I'm very pleased to be here, and I am very pleased to welcome so many participants and to welcome our three fantastic speakers. So joining us today, we have Paul Muto and Philippa Mansfield from Natural England and Kevin Hicks from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And each of them will be speaking for about 15 minutes with 5 minutes for points of clarification. So if anyone does have any questions while we're going through either the technical clarifications or broader questions, if you're able to just pop them into the chat box, that would be great. And Fidelity Weston from PFLA will be answering the questions as we go in the chat, and then raising questions to the panelists, the points of clarification after each speaker, and then Fidelity will be running the Q&A when we get to the end the session. So we are scheduled to finish at 7 p.m, but we are inviting you all to stay on for an additional 15 minutes if anyone wants to continue the discussion or raise any additional questions. If not, we'll all go and have our dinner a bit earlier. So this webinar is being recorded. I want to make you all aware of that, and it will be available on the PFLA's YouTube channel probably tomorrow, but definitely in the next few days. And this is the sixth in a series of webinars that have been hosted by PFLA and Plantlife on species-rich meadows, all of which can be viewed on YouTube if you feel like going back and seeing what was said in the past. And they aim to be a practical approach. And this one tonight on nitrogen follows that same theme of reflecting on the practical ways in which we can address excess nitrogen in our environment. So excess nitrogen in our air, water, soils and ecosystems has a huge impact, not only on our wildlife and natural environment, but on public health and on our climate. Too much nitrogen makes grasslands too rich for many wildflowers to grow, and they lose out to nitrogen-loving grasses. The use of nitrogen fertilizers and intensive livestock systems are among some of the main causes for the loss and destruction of our wildflower meadows and other species-rich grasslands across the UK. These practices also lead to air pollution in forms of ammonia and nitrous oxide gases, and water pollution, which spreads out into the natural environment, damaging wildlife and impacting our public health and our climate. So you can see how these issues around excess nitrogen in our environment and in our farming systems go to the heart of both PFLA's work and Plantlife's work. As a little introduction to the PFLA, I'm sure most of you will be very familiar with them. The PFLA is a membership organisation of around 650, mainly farmers, but they also have butchers, academics, restaurateurs, and just excellent supporters all round who support the aims of promoting the benefits of 100% pasture-fed beef, lamb, and dairy products, which bring environmental, animal welfare, and human health benefits. Many PFLA farmers are grazing on species-rich meadows and grasslands. Others are using new ways of grazing, which means that they can reduce and sometimes completely stop their use of synthetic nitrogen. We are seeing improvements in their biodiversity, the reduction in input costs, and more resilient farming systems that have nature at their heart. For Plantlife, the large-scale restoration of species-rich grasslands across the UK is one of the top priorities in bringing back a real diversity of wild plants and fungi. And as a result, all of the other wildlife and ecosystems that depend on them. Pollinators are, of course, particularly dependent on wild plants. Plantlife has led the call for action to reduce ammonia emissions from farming. And part of this work, you can see our series of reports on our website. These webinars between us and the PFLA are a real opportunity for both organisations to work together and benefit from each other's knowledge and expertise. Both are funded entirely by voluntary donations and membership. So if you'd like to find out more about either organisation, please visit each of our websites respectively. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Paul Muto, a senior specialist in grassland agronomy for Natural England. He has a strong focus on plant-soil relations and how nutrient management can influence yield, forage quality, and plant diversity. He will focus on how we define the various grassland types that exist on farms in order to help us better determine the most appropriate nutrient management regime. So without further ado, I will hand over to Paul.
Okay. Okay, thank you for joining the webinar. Can you see the slide okay there? Yep, okay. My name is Paul Muto, and I'm a senior specialist in grassland agronomy for Natural England. I'll be talking today about the influence of nutrients on grassland growth and grassland diversity. By grassland diversity, I'll be primarily focused on the numbers of plant species that are found, but I will also consider the contribution of grassland to other organisms such as pollinators and other invertebrates, birds, and fungi. As many of you manage grassland, I will aim to make this talk both informative and pragmatic. We will first look at how we classify grassland, keeping it to the three main categories. Although this webinar is very much focused on nitrogen, I will be discussing how it is a challenge to look at one nutrient in isolation. So we will cover the general relationship between nutrients and how they impact both grassland productivity as well as diversity. We will have a look at the conditions under which it is possible to create species-rich grassland and how we can work with our existing grasslands to enhance diversity. As I've already mentioned, there are three broad categories of grassland, so we will start with these. These are important to know because it often determines which agri-environment options are suitable for a particular field. First, we have what is known as improved grassland. These are usually found on our better soils, either within an arable rotation or as permanent grass. These are the result of sowing improved cultivars of forage grasses, most commonly perennial ryegrass, and white or red clover may or may not be included in the mixture. In order to maintain these grasslands, inputs of manure or slurry are required, and often synthetic nitrogen and other nutrients are used. Herbicides are also commonly used. The next category of grassland is known as semi-improved grassland. These are permanent grasslands that may have been sown originally, but over time they've developed a wider range of plant species, usually through natural colonization. These are not fertilized as heavily as improved grassland, so there is usually less than 30% cover of sown species such as perennial ryegrass and white clover. Herbicides may still be used occasionally, so the number of species that are present is usually around 9 to 15 species per square meter. The last category of grassland that we will be discussing is species-rich grassland. These grasslands are often quite ancient and result from a long history of grazing, scrub clearance, and other human impacts. There are many different types of species-rich grassland, such as calcareous grassland, acid grassland, and species-rich hay meadows, but we won't go into these today. Today's webinar is focusing on the role of the plant nutrient nitrogen. One of the main reasons why nitrogen is so central to plant growth is that it is the one nutrient that is needed in the largest amount by plants. As the water barrel illustration above shows, plant growth is limited by the nutrient in shortest supply. This is known as Liebig's law of the minimum, and it is often shown with nitrogen as the shortest stave. However, plant nutrients have complex interactions with each other, as illustrated by another diagram known as Mulder's chart. We won't delve into the details of how this works, but the red arrows illustrate how increases in the availability of one nutrient, and the green arrows, which can inhibit the uptake of other nutrients, and the green arrows indicate relationships where increases in the availability of one nutrient will increase the level of another nutrient. For this reason, I've broadened the discussion to include nutrient management rather than just nitrogen management. The relationship between nutrients and plant diversity has long been a focus of many studies. However, due to the complexities of plant nutrition, plant-soil interaction, and competitive dynamics, we're still learning about this relationship. Because nitrogen has such a strong effect on plant growth, it is often seen as a major factor in the loss of plant diversity, since it tends to favor more competitive plants. However, phosphorus plays a very important role in this as well. If phosphorus levels are very low, then additional nitrogen doesn't have the same stimulating effect on plant growth, since production is limited by the lack of phosphorus. However, if phosphorus is not limiting, then the additional nitrogen will have a big influence on crop growth, thus resulting in the loss of plant species in grasslands. So many of you may have seen this graph before, which is known as a nitrogen response curve. This basically shows that as you increase the supply of nitrogen to plants, you get an increase in yield until you reach the point known as the maximum yield. Any further additions of nitrogen will actually reduce yield. We never fertilize with nitrogen to achieve maximum yield, as the curve begins to flatten as we reach this point. So the amount of extra nitrogen needed is never really worth it economically. For that reason, we have what is known as the on-farm economic optimum rate, which is shown as point B on this slide. I've added in green lines to illustrate how this affects plant diversity. If we focus on the area to the left of point A, which represents the nutrient supply that is just coming from the soil, we find that species-rich grassland on those soils with the lowest nutrient availability. I think I just noticed on my slide that it's missing for some reason. So if you look at the very top point here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, that's where we would find species-rich grassland, which is the lowest amount of nutrients coming from the soil. Plant diversity tends to decrease until we get to a point roughly there, which represents our semi-improved grassland. Remember the green arrow, which you can't see on your screen now, is plant diversity and not yield. Semi-improved grasslands are usually higher yielding but lower in diversity than species-rich grassland. The question is, what is the relationship between fertilizer inputs and diversity as we move to the part of the curve that represents nutrient supply from fertilizer? And that's the part in red there. Oh, there's the arrows. Okay. Okay, before we look at what happens in that part, I just want to introduce a term that is being used more frequently now, and that is multi-species swards. In order to investigate the relationship between diversity and fertility, investigators have been sowing more complex species mixtures and assessing the yields and quality of both both with and without fertilizer. So multi-species swords is commonly used to refer to sown forage mixtures that contain grasses, legumes, and what's known as forage herbs. Forage herbs are species commonly found in many grasslands, which are now selectively bred for forage production. Species like ribwort plantain, chicory, yarrow, forage burnet. Often these are sown in our herbal ley mixtures that I believe we've discussed before. These mixtures of grasses, legumes, and herbs mimics the complex functional diversity found in many natural grasslands. So what we have on the, just click again there. Okay, what we have here is multi-species grassland swords can markedly out-yield perennial ryegrass, there we go, monoculture swords when receiving low inputs of inorganic and fertilizer. Sorry, my arrows keep missing there. Okay. Yeah, so apologies for that. Essentially what that's showing or trying to show is that monoculture grasses don't really out-yield multi-species swords until you get to the higher levels of fertilization. So the question is, why does this work? This is something called niche complementarity. It's important to have plants with distinct traits, whether it's the form of the root or the above ground canopy, in order to maximize the utilization of space, both above and below ground. So the plant species occupy different zones, and thus they capture resources more efficiently. And this is why in nutrient stressed environments, we have a lot of different species, because it's that combination of different traits that allows plant communities to coexist. So we have this is known as functional diversity. Functional groups aren't always fixed, but in most grassland investigations, species are divided into three main functional groups: grasses, legumes, which are lumped together due to their ability to fix nitrogen, and herbs, or broadleaf plants. Herbs are sometimes divided into tall and short herb categories as distinct functional groups, perhaps based on whether it clumps or spreads. Or one can also separate grasses into different groups, perhaps based on whether it clumps or spreads, or even whether it is better adapted to cutting or grazing. The forage herbs, as I mentioned, are commonly these species. And again, I'm just highlighting the various traits that these have that allow it to access different nutrients. Dandelions are a common herb that have a taproot and a rosette growth, making it quite resilient to grazing. Chicory has a taproot and a rosette form until it flowers when it shoots up. And ribwort plantain, again, has a rosette growth with fibrous roots, unlike dandelion or chicory, again, accessing a different pool of nutrients. Yarrow is quite unique in that it has both a fibrous root system and it spreads by stolons and rhizomes, slowly spreading through the grassland. And other broadleaf plants can fall into these various functional groups as well. I just wanted to show this slide because it shows the kind of unexpected advantages of some of these complex mixtures. This is from the Toolbox of Multi-Species Swords project, which is carried out by Dutch College in Rothamsted. And on the right-hand side, it shows a complex mixture with several functional groups. It's a herbal ley. And on the left is simply a ryegrass clover mixture with an abundance of thistles. So there's something in the dynamic of the multiple species there that is inhibiting the emergence of weeds. or at least thistles in this case. So in addition to functional diversity, we can also talk about structural diversity. So this is an important way that we can manage our grasslands, perhaps if we're only have semi-improved grasslands without the full range of diversity, in a way that'll also help to provide for diversity. So having different structural features in a grassland can provide important habitat for creatures associated with grassland. So on the left shows a burrowing bee hole, which relies on areas of bare soil to create nesting burrows. On the right are tussocks of cocksfoot, which often form through selective grazing. The tussocks themselves become important physical structures for invertebrates. And in fact, when I was taking this photo just a few days ago, as soon as I snapped the photo, a bumblebee had emerged from one of the tussocks, showing it's important as a sheltering habitat for the bee. Structural diversity can also be associated with grazing. Grasses dominate in ungrazed areas, whereas if dominant grasses are suppressed by grazing, as in the photo on the right, it allows other species to survive. So each habitat, whether it's grazed or ungrazed, can be associated with a specific range of diversity. Now, in addition, there's a wide range of interactions and organisms that occur underground. And this is an area that I won't delve into today, but fungal diversity is often a very interesting trait associated with above ground biodiversity. So that's something that, again, is something to explore in future discussions. So just to wrap things up, I would say that species-rich grasslands are quite difficult to achieve on most improved agricultural grasslands. And this is primarily due to the higher nutrient levels, particularly phosphorus, that we find in most improved grasslands. Grasslands receiving little or no external inputs of fertilizer can be productive and moderately diverse. Having legumes and forage herbs as functional groups within these grasslands can provide diversity and also resilience to permanent grassland. Structural diversity in grasslands, things like bare soil, tussocks, and variation in grazing management also helps in supporting other biodiversity. So that's another important goal to have in managing your grassland as we move towards more diversity in our forages. So at that point, I'd like to wrap things up. And if we have a chance for any questions, I can hopefully answer those now.
Yes, thank you very much, Paul. And we're certainly looking forward to a future discussion on fungal diversity in the future. Can I ask Fidelity, who's been monitoring the chat, if there are any specific questions for Paul at this point?
No specific questions for Paul. In fact, no questions at all in the chat. So do put some questions in the chat, everybody, and we can include them in the discussion at the end.
Great. Okay, I will then hand over to Philippa. So Philippa Mansfield is a former agronomist who works in natural England as an agricultural lead for catchment sensitive farming partnerships, which offers advice to farmers in priority areas in England on farm practices and infrastructure improvements to reduce air and water pollution from farming. She will focus in her talk on the practical actions that farmers can take on their farms to improve nitrogen use efficiency and reduce nitrogen losses into the environment, which would save costs and reducing losses of nitrogen as nitrates, ammonias, and nitrous oxides, which impact air, water quality, climate change, and biodiversity. So I shall hand over to Philippa now.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along to speak. Can you see my screen okay? Great. Okay. So I'm going to focus now a bit more on use of nitrogen as a nutrient for a farm business and also the effects on biodiversity and in particular how you can reduce nitrogen inputs and losses from grassland. So in case you haven't heard of us, the Catchment Sensitive Farming Partnership's been going for about 15 years now. We're a partnership between Natural England, the Environment Agency and DEFRA, and we've mainly been focusing on water quality advice up till now, but we're now embedding air quality advice into what we do. So we work through a network of catchment sensitive farming officers who are trusted local advisors working with farmers in priority areas. So those are the red areas on the map there, but we're actually being funded by DEFRA to expand out to cover most of England from next year. And we provide free advice to farmers on improvements to farm infrastructure and land management, and also advice and support.
Sorry.
Hi.
Philippa, can I just interrupt? Terribly sorry, but actually, I think it might be possible for you to make your slide bigger and fill the whole screen, because at the moment we've got your current slide and then your next slide. So are you able to move it so that it's full screen? Perhaps up at the top at display settings. There's a little drop down.
Struggling to see where display settings has gone to. I'll look for more.
It's up for, at least for me, it's directly above the sensitive bit of your title. You go straight up. Slightly to the right.
Yeah, I can't see it actually. I don't know why. Because I had it before. Is that any better? No.
Did you go into display settings before, Philippa? And
oh, here we go. Now it's up there. Okay, I'll swap. There we go. Is that better?
Perfect.
yeah,
Yes.
well done.
Okay, sorry about that, everybody.
Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. I'll just move on. So yeah, I was just explaining what the CSF project was, and our main drivers are air and water quality, but we also have secondary objectives of providing advice on flood management and water resources, and we have a specific role in supporting farmers in making applications for countryside stewardship grants. And a lot of the advice that we give is not only good for the environment, but it's also good for farm businesses. So I'm going to talk now about nitrogen use deficiency, and that's really about making the most of the outputs in terms of nitrogen, in terms of yield of grain and grass, milk or meat, whatever you're farming, and minimizing the inputs from soil nitrogen, fertilizer, manures or feed nitrogen, so that you're getting the most out of every kilogram of nitrogen that you're using. So if you look at the farm nutrient loop on the right hand side there, you start with the soil. You want to get the most out of the soil in terms of nitrogen, and then what you might put on in terms of manures and fertilizers, and maximize the efficiency there and the utilization by the crop, getting the most going to the grain or into the grass, whatever you're growing. And then again, making the most efficient use of what's being fed to the animals. So not putting too much protein into their feed, which will then be lost through excretion and then potentially lost as ammonia, but just what they need. And then recovering any outputs from the animals as manure, and that goes back into the soil again. So it's really about keeping nitrogen within that loop. So if you think about what nitrogen inputs and what losses there could be in a grass field, if you start off with nitrate in the middle there, nitrate is the preferred nutrient source for nitrogen by the plant. So plants will be taking up nitrate, but they'll also take up ammonium. But the nitrate can also get lost as nitrous oxide and nitrogen to the air. So nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas there. And it can get lost through leaching, which can then get into watercourses. It's a very mobile chemical, so it is easily lost. And then if you think about if you might be putting some fertilizer on here, so the urea in the yellow there, that breaks down to ammonium, and there's a risk there of losing ammonia from that through volatilization before it turns into nitrate or gets taken up by the plant as ammonium or as nitrate. But you can use various inhibitors, urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors, which slow down those chemical reactions and reduce the losses of nitrate and ammonia. And the other important factor here is the soil organic matter, which will be breaking down to produce nitrate, which the plant can use, but also fixing some of the nitrogen that's in the soil. And the soil biology is the key to that, and how well that nutrient cycling is happening in the soil. So by improving nitrogen use efficiency, you can benefit the environment through water quality, greenhouse gas emissions and ammonia emissions, but it can also improve pasture productivity, milk and meat yield, fertilizer and reduce fertilizer and feed costs, and so improve farm profitability. So I'm just going to talk a bit about some of these losses and why they're important to us and the environment. So first of all, ammonia. If you think about ammonia, the formula is NH3, so nitrogen is obviously part of that, and we're losing 254,000 tons of ammonia in the UK from farming, and that's worth about £138 million in terms of actual value of nitrogen if you were going to buy it as fertilizer, and that equates to about £8 a hectare of nitrogen that's being lost. So there's a good reason for reducing the amount of ammonia that we're losing and making that nitrogen work for you and work for your crops. So the UK signed up to international targets to reduce ammonia emissions by 16% by 2030. And the reason why they've done that is to reduce the impacts that it's having on biodiversity and health. So ammonia can have or several types of impacts on biodiversity. So it acts as a nitrogen enrichment. So you get nitrogen loving plants taking over, and as we just heard from Paul, that then reduces biodiversity. So you get the grasses which like nitrogen taking over and out competing the less competitive species. So you get a decline in biodiversity where you have those impacts on sites. And over 90% of our most valuable sites, SSSIs, are actually exceeding their critical load for nitrogen deposition. It can also have an acidification effect, which can affect certain habitats. And there are some species which are very sensitive to ammonia, and it can have a toxic effect on those. And that is in particular the lower plants, mosses and lichens and liverworts. So the picture on the bottom right there is healthy sphagnum on the left and unhealthy sphagnum on the right. And this is at a site in Northern Ireland that's been very badly damaged by ammonia from farming around the lowland bog there. The reason why this is important, not only losing biodiversity, but also losing a key store for carbon. But ammonia also has an impact on human health. So it reacts with other air pollutants to form particulates, very fine particulates, which then cause cardiothoracic disease and increased mortality and lower both birth weights. So it's really in the frame for doing something about how we reduce ammonia and how we reduce those impacts of air quality on health and biodiversity. So in response to that, DEFRA have published the Clean Air Strategy. It covers all air pollutants, but ammonia has specific chapter there, and there's some a series of actions which have been laid out that are definitely going to phase in over the next 7 years or so, which will look at, first of all, fertilizer use. So there's been a consultation on use of urea. That they're looking at use of low emission spreaders for slurry and digestate, covering of slurry stores, introducing permitting for cattle and dairy, as well as pig and poultry, and possibly even design standards for housing. And finally, more rapid incorporation of solid manures within 12 hours so that we reduce the losses of ammonia. So something that everybody needs to be aware of is coming down the track. So where's the ammonia coming from? Well, 87% of ammonia emissions are from agriculture, which is why there are so many actions that we need to think about in the industry, and how we can reduce that. And mainly within farming, it's from beef and dairy farms, is about half of the sources of ammonia, followed by poultry, and then pigs and sheep, and some from horses. And in terms of which part of the farm operations it's coming from, the biggest chunk is from housing, so livestock housing. So your approach as pasture-fed livestock association of having more outdoor grazing is beneficial for ammonia emissions, so that's good. But a lot of it's also coming from manure application and fertilizer application, so the nutrient management is key to this. And then smaller amounts from manure storage, that includes slurry storage and grazing outdoors, hard standings, and sewage sludge application, and digestate application. So I just want to talk about the impacts of nitrate losses quickly now, just to give the context of why we need to be concerned about these losses for the environment. So nitrate can cause water pollution. It's mostly leached during the winter when the rainfall's high and the temperatures are low, so there's more limited crop growth, and you don't get that uptake of nitrogen. And most of the nitrate is coming from agriculture that gets into our groundwater. It can cause excess algal growth in marine water, so that's Bosham Harbour there, where you get this extra growth of algae, which then suffocates the water bodies, and it can cause fish death and other species to die off. But it's also important for drinking water quality. So nitrates can, if we're trying to extract drinking water from a safeguard zone, for example, there'll be a drinking water limit imposed there, and water companies will either face excess costs to deal with any excesses, or they might not be able to source the abstract the water from that source. And that's because of the health effects that nitrate has. Just finally, the greenhouse gas aspect of losses of nitrogen. So 9% of greenhouse gases are coming from agriculture. That percentage, it looks to be increasing as other areas address their emissions. And 70% of the nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture are actually coming from agriculture. So that's a bigger problem that is linked with agriculture there, and it's actually 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So one that we need to pay even more attention to. And those emissions are coming from grazing livestock, storage and application of organic manures, and nitrogen fertilizer. So a lot of the actions that we will take to reduce ammonia emissions and nitrate losses will also actually have a benefit for nitrous oxide losses. There's also carbon dioxide emissions, which are linked to the manufacture of nitrate fertilizer to look at, although there are some moves to improve the efficiency of that process. But we need to put that against the carbon storage potential of grassland and soils. So farmers are actually part of the solution to the climate change problems, as well as needing to address some of the issues. Okay, so the first starting point is nutrient use efficiency. Improving nutrient management planning will help you reduce your nutrient use efficiency and then reduce the nitrogen lost as nitrates or ammonia or nitrous oxide. At the moment, typically in cereal crops, at least, only 60% of the nitrogen that's applied is actually taken up by the cereal crop, and the other 40% is lost to the environment or locked up in soil organic matter. So there's great potential in improving that, and the starting point is getting back to basics and maybe matching what the crop requires in terms of nitrogen for growth with what is actually applied, and that means that the crop will take up the whatever nitrogen is in the soil or applied. So that's getting the basics right, the right type of fertilizer, the right amount, the right time, the right place, and in the right way. And you can improve the accuracy of that using by calibrating your spreaders, or using precision techniques such as variable rate application, bout width controls, and near infrared spectrometry to make sure that you're more precisely putting on the rate of nitrogen that the crop actually needs. And that applies to grassland just as much as any other crop. So I won't stay on this too long because Paul's already covered it. So as we know, nitrogen is not the only nutrient, and yield is limited by whichever is in short supply, and that includes pH as well. And most notably, sulfur is really key to nitrogen uptake. They're directly linked, and 88% of grassland is deficient in sulfur. So it's important to make sure that you're supplying enough sulfur and regularly at the same time as you're applying nitrogen, so that you're not wasting whatever you're applying. And also making use of whatever you're putting on in terms of organic manures and what's in the soil. So when you're working out a nutrient management plan for your grassland, the starting point is what's being supplied by the soil. That's based on previous cropping, the length of time it's been in grass, how much nitrogen has been applied in the past, and rainfall. And then what have you got available in terms of nitrogen from any organic manures you might have on the farm or might import onto the farm. So there's a range of organic manures, and they will vary in what the nitrogen content is, but also importantly how much is available, and that has an effect on whether it's lost as nitrate or whether it's readily available to the crop as well. So the RB209 has a whole section on organic manures where you can look up the nutrient contents and availability, but you can also do your analysis to get that more accurate. And integrating manure and fertilizer supply can reduce ammonia emissions and nitrate leaching by about 10%, as well as nitrous oxide losses. So the method that HDB Nutrient Management Guide gives for nutrient management planning is looking at the grass growth class, and that is basically determined by the type of soil that you have available, and the rainfall, which means how much water you have available for that crop, and also by the limited by altitude. So very high altitudes, then the grass will not have a high potential for growth. And then the graph on the right hand side here is grass yield against nitrogen application. So you can see here how you can increase grass yield by increasing nitrogen application, but it needs to be within the potential of that grass in the field that you're looking at. So there's no point in putting a very high dose on if actually the potential growth is not going to take that up, and it would just be lost. It's worth thinking in terms of across the whole field and across the whole farm. What's the potential of the different fields and the different soils and swards on your farm, and how could they maximize the utilization of any nitrogen inputs, and focus most inputs on that one's fields with high yield potential, and maybe have some with high diversity where they've got lower levels of fertility. So these are the recommendations that are given in RB209, So it's very much worked out on the basis of what your target yield is and the nitrogen applications through the season. But it's important to remember that you need to also adjust the applications depending on what's happening in that season. So these very early applications would only be suitable where there's a long growing season and where the temperature is high enough for the grass to be growing. And at the other end of the season, if we've got a drought and the grass isn't growing, then if you put a nitrogen on there, they're just going to be lost. And also bear in mind there's regulations that cover this. So the farming rules for water say that you should only be applying nutrients if there's a soil or crop need. And MVZs have various limits and closed periods for when you can apply nitrogen. So just talk a bit about legumes, because this is a brilliant free source of nitrogen from the air. It's not exactly free because you have to pay for the legumes, but by replacing nitrogen fertilizers with clovers in grass, you're reducing ammonia emissions by potentially 50%, and nitrate ammonium and nitrate leaching by 20%, and similarly for nitrous oxide. So good for the environment, and also saving money on nitrogen fertilizers. Legumes can also be used in arable rotations, and of course these can then be used as feed, alternative feed sources for the stock, and there'll be a balance of soil nitrogen supply for the next crop. And herbal lays with legumes built into them will provide that nitrogen source, and also various legumes will be suitable for different soils, some of them more drought tolerant than others. So we'll also be a way of building the soil organic matter, improving soil biology, and the variable rooting depths will help break up soil compaction and improve drought tolerance, as well as the benefits for biodiversity that we've already mentioned, and potentially for stock health. So nitrogens from clovers in grass, the new varieties are actually being bred for really high levels of nitrogen fixing, but it really depends on the amount of cover that you got in your grass. So the three pictures there show with the increasing clover cover, you get increasing amounts of nitrogen supplied by the clover. But to get that maximum amount out of your clover, you need to have the soil in good condition, the right pH, phosphorus indexes at target 2, avoiding soil compaction, and the maximum of 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare of nitrogen applied spring or late autumn. And if you want to build up clover, actually it's better not to put on nitrogen, because that will stop the fixing. There's some more information on AHDB website on that. So nitrogen fertilizers actually vary quite a lot in terms of how much ammonia is lost from them. So from urea, you can get anything from 12% losses, as we can see here, right up to 30 or 40%. And it really depends on when you're applying it. So early in the season, you get less when it's cooler and wet, but later on when it's hot weather, you'll get more of that ammonia volatilization. So switching to something like ammonium nitrate or calcium ammonium nitrate will really bring down the ammonia losses. So the emissions there are under 2%, and UAN and ammonium sulfate and DAP is something in between. But you can also use urea with urease inhibitors, which slows down the hydrolysis of that urea and allows it time to diffuse into the soil. And that can reduce ammonia reductions by 70%. So, and if you work out what the cost of the nitrogen that you're losing as ammonia, this farm case study we had here, you can actually save money by using urea with an inhibitor, even though it costs more, because you're losing that value in nitrogen. Another way of reducing ammonia emissions is by extending the grazing season for cattle. But this really depends on whether the grass and the soil is suitable, Obviously, we don't want to increase the loss of sediment and nutrients and fecal indicator organisms if the soil is damaged through outwintering of cattle. So it'd be interesting to hear about how you manage that on your land. Just something about a trip to the Netherlands that we did, where they're doing rotational grazing on a lowland dairy farm here, and they're doing this to reduce ammonia emissions, and they're focusing on what they're feeding the cows to reduce the amount of proteins that's being fed, so that they then emit less ammonia. And one of the techniques they used was to allow the grass to grow a bit longer than they would normally, so that it became more fibrous, and that had the effect of slowing down the digestion of the cows, so they got more of the protein out of the grass. So actually the grass had lower protein levels in it, but because they slowed down digestion, the cows were getting more protein out of it. And finally, I just like to say it all starts off with the soil. So having a really good soil structure with a functioning soil biology, which is breaking down and recycling the nutrients, and allowing the plants to take up the nutrients before they're lost through whatever form, is the key to getting this right. And if you'd like to find out more about catchment sensitive farming, have a look on our website. We've got some really good case studies on there, or get in touch with your CSFO.
Well, thank you very much, Philippa. That was very interesting. Fidelity, are there any questions specifically for Philippa at this point?
I think there's one question here, Honor, which is for Philippa. Otherwise, there are lots of good questions coming up we can deal with the end. But this one, I think, Philippa, is for you. It says that, do nitrogen budgets on farms ever take N deposition into account, for example, from nearby dairy, pig and poultry units? You said that 40% of nitrogen applied to cereal crops was lost, presumably in part because the crops didn't need it. Much of the organic matter applied, at least on some farms, seems to be a way of disposing of waste, either from agriculture or industry. Is there any or much recognition in the farming industrial communities that fertilizer spreading to land is not always a good thing?
Okay, there's quite a lot in that question, but yes, nutrient budgets should take into account what's being deposited from the atmosphere, and it's surprising how much nitrogen is being deposited. Sometimes it can be 25 kilograms per hectare, which is almost like a dose of initial dose of nitrogen that you would apply, and the recommendations for nitrogen application actually were done within the environment of nitrogen deposition, so they are taking account of the fact that there is nitrogen deposition from the air. The other part of that question about sorry, I can't remember the second bit of the question.
Fidelity, are you able to just read the question again for Philippa?
Oh, just about the awareness of manure use. Yes, so I mean, we have a problem in that there is so much manure in particular parts of the country that we're actually got an excess of nutrients in some parts of the country, and actually a deficit in other parts of the country. But of course, it's not very easy to move around, and really that there are there are occasions when no fertilizer would be there'll be enough nutrients within just a manure application, but fertilizer use does enable better yields by actually targeting nutrient when you need it. So putting it on in spring when the grass is just about to grow, and through the season to keep that growth going will affect yields. It also could have a detrimental effect on biodiversity, of course, but it really depends on what you're trying to get out of that particular field.
Great, that's very helpful.
Okay, thanks.
If we move on to our last speaker today, so Dr. Kevin Hicks is a Senior Research Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, based in the Department of Environment and Geography at the University of York. He specialises in the use of scientific knowledge for practical action, to reduce pollution and its impacts on the environment, especially related to nitrogen. He will describe the integrated nitrogen management on Yorkshire farms project, looking at practical steps farmers can take to increase soil health and nitrogen use efficiency on their farms to increase the profitability and sustainability of their business while protecting the environment. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm just going to get my screen shared. Okay. So screen 2. Are you able to see my slides? I'll have the same problem as Philippa, is that?
No, it looks great to me.
Oh, you can see it okay, yeah?
Yeah. Fantastic.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me today. I'd like to share a project with you which we're doing in Yorkshire at the moment. And it's an evidence-based good practice for integrated nitrogen management on Yorkshire farms. And it's myself and my colleague Jean McKendry working at the University of York. And we're working closely also with Pippa Chapman at the University of Leeds. And it's funded by the ICASP Integrated Catchment Solutions Programme of NERC. So the work I want to show you today is very much done in conjunction with stakeholders, many stakeholders. And as we've had a fantastic introduction from Paul and Philippa to the issues involved with, nitrogen, but also more broadly nutrient management. And on the screen here, you can see a range of stakeholders that with key stakes in this issue. So the Agricultural Horticultural Development Board, DEFRA, of course, with their fertilizer team and soil team. So all these stakeholders and key Yorkshire stakeholders have been included in this work, so that what I'm going to present today is a kind of consensus version of how we're going to go about producing a guidance document on how to do this nitrogen management. So harking back to the introductions we've had from the other speakers, what is the problem? So in terms of nitrogen, we have what Mark Sutton at the CEH Edinburgh calls the wages of nitrogen. And the wages of nitrogen is a really nice way of remembering that it affects water, as we've heard, nitrate pollution. It affects the air quality by ammonia contributing to the small fine particulate matter, which affects human health and has a whole host of effects on human health. It affects the greenhouse gas balance, so through N2O emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, but also, of course, because it stimulates growth, it can be related to carbon sequestration as well. And as we're focusing on today, nitrogen can have a profound effect on the biodiversity of the system that you're looking at, and especially grasslands, where famously nitrogen deposition from the air has shifted the composition of many grasslands in the UK from species rich to species impoverished, with the loss of a lot of the keystones, a lot of the species of high conservation value, often the forbs. And then, of course, the S of wages is the soils. And across England, we know that the soils have been degraded, and traditional, conventional farming can really deteriorate the soil quality. So at the center of the project I want to describe is how can we turn the wages of nitrogen in the environment into wages for the farmers? And this is very much related to what Philippa presented about how can we tighten up the nitrogen cycle so that we get nitrogen to where we need it to be and into the plant growth and minimize the losses. And as some of the people have put in the question box, how can we really reduce our nitrogen input so we don't have to include nitrogen? And also, if you think about the push to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, one of the central tenets of that is to minimize artificial fertilizer additions. So there's a lot of pressures on the farming system at the moment to deal with all these environmental pressures at once. And then the key considerations for our project were the farmers are very busy and have to be focused on maintaining a profitable business. Improving environmental impact in farming requires some kind of financial payback. Policies that are not joined up across the wages as I described them can have unanticipated consequences, such as pollution swapping. So you deal with one pollutant, but you end up making the situation worse for another one. And we need a level playing field for payments to produce action across the different environmental impacts, so that taking action for one particular aspect will not exacerbate the impacts in another area. So when we were developing our guidance, the rationale was we wanted to leverage the existing science that is often inaccessible to farmers. And as I think the talks have demonstrated, there's a whole host of factors to consider, and it's a very complex area. So how can we help farmers navigate this huge knowledge base that we have? And how can we help the farmer networks and advisors in particular who are giving farmers advice? How can we help them navigate all the guidance that is coming their way for soil and nutrient management? And how can we support the development of an overarching approach to match farmer actions to policy ambition, and help policymakers to take a systems approach, which is enshrined in the 25-year environmental plan? And quite often, the practicalities of farming are not taken into account when the policies are being rolled out. So we want to try and have a very practical approach. So the aims of the in my farm project, the integrated nitrogen management on Yorkshire farms, is to synthesize best practice and the best available science and good practice to inform more integrated and efficient nitrogen use in arable, livestock and mixed farming. But at the outset with a focus on Yorkshire, but as we go on, we hope to make our results applicable to the wider UK. We want to create the initial guidance to support the integrated nitrogen management at farm level through the farmers' networks and advisors, but very much linking to the developing national policy, which is changing a lot, obviously, with the Brexit and the big push for net carbon zero. And we're going to produce our guidance in July. So what is the guidance going to look like? Well, the consultation so far with the stakeholders I showed you has highlighted that soil health is a key organizing principle. It is a key resource that underpins farmers' livelihoods, of course, and soil health is more tangible than talking about integrated nitrogen management. And also, it can relate to all the aspects of the wages, and it's environmental and economic, and it also links to, I think I've skipped a slide there, haven't I? Sorry. Yeah, and it provides the focus for a systems approach that that can cover a host of environmental concerns, including flood management and soil erosion. As we heard, if you look after the quality of your soil and the structure of your soil, you can hold nutrients more effectively and also retain moisture more effectively. So the structure of the guidance will be for arable, upland, livestock, and mixed lowland and arable and livestock systems. And it will be, we're structuring it around the farmer's calendar, highlighting key decisions that the farmer has to make around the year that affect nitrogen use and soil health. And the rationale is based on the wages as I described them. And the three case studies will link to existing information, of which there is a lot. And it will, the idea is to help people navigate the huge amount of information. So here's an example of our mix system that we're developing at the moment. So Jenny Dungate's working with Angus Gowthorpe, who's a mixed farmer in the Vale of York, and they put together this annual cycle of his approach to on his farm, where he's using regenerative farming approaches. So he's using cover and catch crops. He never leaves the soil bare. He doesn't do any tilling. Any ploughing, and you can see in this example where the pinch points are through the year where nitrogen has to be applied. So what we want to do is take a annual cycle for our 3 systems, and then zoom into when the nitrogen is applied, and then think about how we can give really good advice on practical advice on how to control the leakage of nitrogen into the environment, as Philippa nicely showed earlier. So the guidance will contain, what are the attributes of good soil health from physical, chemical, and biological perspectives, and it will take in nitrogen use efficiency, of course. And then, practical advice on how you feed the soil. So we've heard about organic amendments and inorganic sources. We've seen a lot of questions in the question and answer there about, when you can add, when you can add manures, and when you can add, should you be adding inorganics at all? And as Philippa showed you, if you consider, the 3 or 4 R's, the right time, the right place, the right fertilizer, in the right system, etc., you can really minimize the losses. And we're starting this at a background where a lot of systems can only be 50% efficient, whereas the nitrogen's reaching the target, and quite often 50% is then lost to the environment. So there's a lot we can do to tighten the nitrogen cycle, but we have to be very careful how we do it in terms of the different types of impacts. And then how do you work the soil? The traditional approach is to till the soil, but we know that there's minimal tillage and there's no tillage. How do these things play into the nutrient cycle? And then there's the cropping and the intensive versus regenerative practices. How can you control your nitrogen in these different situations? And then very much relevant to the pastures, animal management. How, when should you bring your animals out onto the field? There's a lot of practical considerations on when you should take your animals out into the field, and how practical is it to keep the animals out there for longer? And then when you're thinking about using slurry, what are the key conditions for the storage, and then when are the best conditions for applying it, and how should you apply it to minimize these the losses? And then there's the interactions with other farms and practices in terms of wildlife areas and natural flood management. And then really importantly, I think, is this link to the policy and the sources of payment and the emerging ELM scheme, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, and how farmers can navigate on that to be able to understand the payments that they might receive for the different options that they could take on their land. So the practical end of the guidance is that will be ready for release in July, will be based on this scheme, where we have for a particular outcome we have a series of indicators, and we look at how farmers at the moment are practically able to measure some of these indicators. So several surveys have revealed that not all, there's only 50% say of farmers that are actually having nutrient management plans, and then of those farmers, some of those farmers are not able to make the measurements that could go with those plans to see exactly what the status is of the nitrogen in their soils and when they should be making amendments. And then there's the monitoring component, where you determine the soil status of benchmarks. So as we know, any farm will have a whole host of different conditions, and even a single field can have a whole range of different conditions where you might want to do different things in different parts of the field. So we're looking at advice on how farmers can approach that. And then looking at appropriate indicator values. So when we're trying to balance the outcome for the different environmental impacts, what type of soil measurements and values are we looking for key indicators? And then the actions linked to that, guidance on available options, costs and funding sources, including how regenerative farming approaches feed into the equation. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase farmer confidence in undertaking nutrient management. And by that I mean, in some cases, traditionally it's like a farmer would always put on as much nitrogen as they can to make sure that the yield is there, perhaps. And we're trying to do practical tools, introduce practical tools into their work, so that they could be more confident that the nitrogen they're putting in is being used and that less is being lost. And then the outcome we really want to see is then, can that be related to payments for tightening the end cycle, as it were. And then increasing knowledge, we want to increase knowledge of opportunities for cost savings and payments, and achieving key goals and increasing biodiversity. And for example, you know, if you could put your nitrogen on in a way that it's mostly taken up by the plant, then you are saving a lot of money in the first instance. But if you can link this to payments for environmental protection, then all the better. We want to advise informed. Our advice is going to be informed by practical constraints faced by the farmers, which I think is often a factor not adequately taken into consideration. And we want to provide advice for protecting soil health in a changing climate for sustainable businesses. So in a 5 to 10 year time frame, you know, how can you protect your soils that are being subjected to these extreme events? So this is a work in progress, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to promote this today. And I can see from the questions that are coming in that there's a whole host of things that to be considered that people need advice on. So that's very welcome. But please get in touch if you're interested in linking to the guidance when it's produced. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Fidelity, at this point, should we just check whether there are any points of clarification in chat specifically for Kevin? Yes. And then we can move into the wider Q&A afterwards.
Yes, so there's one very specific question here, Kevin, from Stephen Prowse. He says, what methodology are you using to do soil worm counts?
We've not settled on any particular one. We're in the process of determining which methods will be promoted, but it will be ones that are in use and have been proven on the ground to be useful. Sorry, but that's the best answer I can give at the moment.
Fine. Thank you. That was the only one that was specific to Kevin. Paul's done a brilliant job of answering a lot of the questions on the chat and quite a few of the questions on the Q&A as we've been going through. So Paul, thank you very much for doing that. There's been a lot of questions about high phosphorus and reducing phosphate, and I've seen that you've answered some of them, Paul, but I was just thinking it might be worth it in case people missed that. That there are a couple that I thought were related, which is specifically if you've got a field with high phosphate and high nitrogen and you want to reduce it in order to reintroduce wildflowers, what would be the best method of going around to reduce those high phosphate levels? And linked with that question, which is one I think you've sort of answered, is the high phosphorus geologically related, or is it always management related?
Did you want me to answer just on the call?
You could probably answer both of those questions, can't you?
I'll try. Okay, with regards to whether it's geological or a relic of applications, I would say there was certainly soil types in the UK that are naturally very low in phosphorus, so they would be ones that would be very good for creating species-rich grassland. And also, it isn't always necessarily the total amount of phosphorus in the soil, but whether the pH is in the correct zone for uptake. So even with high phosphorus levels, if the pH is either very high or very low, that phosphorus becomes unavailable. So in a sense, it's a low phosphorus soil due to the fact that you're on calcareous or very acidic soils. Most soils where we have high phosphorus is due to cropping. It's very, at least in the UK, you wouldn't find soils that are just naturally high in phosphates. You may get fairly, good soils with regards to phosphate levels where you have alluvial deposition or something like that. But you wouldn't really get high phosphorus levels. That's almost always a relic of fertilizer applications.
That's great, thank you. Does Philippa or Kevin, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, just to say that, I agree with Paul. Where we see very high levels of phosphate is normally where there's been historically high applications of organic manures that built up the phosphate levels, particularly on usually fields just that are easy to get to and spread manure onto nearer the farm. So I agree. It's mostly to do with application of mainly manures, but also could be fertilizer.
Yeah. But manure can be definitely a problem. So that's something that we're including in our advice.
So that sort of brings me on, Kevin, to the next question. There's a question here, which is there a difference in nitrogen loss between the various forms of nitrogen, such as farmyard manure, compared to synthetic nitrogen?
Yes, there is. So your classic inorganic fertilizers, like ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate, it's all to do with the mineralization in the soil. So if nitrate, as Philippa showed you, is very mobile in the soil. So if you're applying nitrate at a time when the plants aren't taking it up, it can leave straight away. So it can be leached from the soil. And so that's one thing to take into consideration. And with manures, you have to be, when you're adding organic content, you have to, if you're composting it and it's in the right state, when it's added, and you can work out, it's possible to work out the fertilizer equivalents of manures, so that you can make sure that the nitrogen's being delivered at the right time. Otherwise, you can have organic matter staying in the soil and not being available straight away, and it has to be mineralized in the soil before it becomes available to the plants. So there's several factors to take into account when you're choosing your fertilizer input. And then the other thing that we're encountering in our guidance is that there's a whole host of things that that the farmer can consider to make the amendment for the nitrogen inputs. So you've got these green manures, but you've also got digestates from anaerobic digestion, and sometimes if these are related to food waste, for example, they can be very high in salt, and they can be very high in micronutrients. So you have to be very careful what you're adding in terms of unwanted effects that you can have. So it's definitely an area where good solid advice is needed about to get a really good handle on when the nitrogen's available to the plants.
Are you able to say, there's another question here, which is what impact does ammonia have on the microbiological activity within the soil?
Yeah, I'm not aware of the impact of ammonia on the soil. Ammonia is lost into the air, it's volatilized as gas into the air. So the impacts are then when it deposits as nitrogen onto the soil, which is actually through rain and through it could be dry deposition. So there's an acidification effect that ammonia has, which potentially could affect soil microbes, but I'm not aware of any information on that. I don't know if anybody else knows. No. Okay, sorry.
Again, connected with all of this there's a question here, which is, does sward lifting affect the nutrient availability, or is it just a coincidence?
It will do to some extent. Sometimes you get a check in the growth of the grass through sward lifting, because you're basically cutting through the roots at the surface level, and so, but they do recover. So, I mean, it's only worth doing sward lifting if you have a compaction problem in the soil that you need to use a sward lift to try and alleviate that compaction. But you do see a kind of check in that grass growth, which will then recover later. So only something to do to sort out a problem, not routinely.
Paul or Kevin, do you want to add to that at all? No, if not, I'll just go on straight. The next question, Philippa, is probably also for you, which is that, but it's actually to everybody. But do the panelists have any suggestions for making the application of slurry more wildlife friendly? But then related to that is another question: is why is nothing done when farmers spread slurry on frozen soils or in wet periods in the winter?
Yes, so slurry can be applied through low emission methods, so trailing hose or trailing shoe which places it on the soil beneath the canopy of the grass, will reduce ammonia emissions, or injecting it into the soil will reduce emissions further. So that will have a benefit in terms of the ammonia impact. And also applying it at the right time, so that it's going to be taken up by the crop, of course, is another factor in slurry, and not putting it on places where it can run off and get into watercourses, making sure that there is active plant growth there, which is going to take it up, and that is suitable for applying. The question about applying slurry on frozen ground, of course, that is not good practice. I think it's a shame. It's a shame that that's not picked up on better. We have a kind of lack of Environment Agency taking action on that type of bad practice. It's quite so I think that's something that everybody wants to improve, really. I don't know if anybody else has got comments on that.
Somebody in the chat's just said that we didn't properly answer the question about, if you've got high phosphorus, how can you reduce it? What activities can you do to actually reduce the phosphorus in your soils quickly to try and get a bit of sward diversity going?
If it's high, you can remove phosphorus by essentially cutting and removing vegetation. However, there's very few plants that actually take up phosphorus to any large degree. Of all the plant functional groups, it's probably legumes that take up phosphorus in the greatest amount. So there have been experiments done to reduce phosphorus by promoting legume growth, cutting and removing the legumes, and that over time, and we're talking minimal 5 years, but probably even longer depending on how high the P index is, you can slowly reduce the soil phosphorus levels. In order to get the good legume growth, however, and make sure that you're removing sufficient P, it's been shown to be beneficial to apply supplemental potash, because legumes have a fairly high potash demand, and keep your pH near neutral for best legume growth.
There are a few
you
questions.
can use soil stripping as well, which is removing the topsoil, which is done on some sites, but I wouldn't, phosphorus is a scarce resource and important for agriculture. So in a sense, I'd want to look at, would you ever achieve, real species richness on that piece of land, or is it perhaps better focused as a productive field with moderate levels of diversity? Because there's always a trade-off.
You're being asked here, Paul, thank you for the answer to that question, and being asked, what have you got any suggestions for how you would actually raise your phosphate naturally if you needed to do it?
How you would raise it? Well, you could always apply artificial phosphorus fertilizer, but if you were organic, if you purchase in manures or slurries from an off-farm source, that will probably be your best source of phosphorus to raise the soil P.
There's a good question here, which is something that I think would be of great interest to a lot of us who are changing our grazing management, which is that, is there any evidence or research done to show how holistic and regenerative grazing management alters or affects the nitrogen requirements for grass swards? I mean, we know in the PFLA, anecdotally, that a lot of our farmers who've been doing mob grazing for a number of years have completely, they don't need to put any nitrogen on their soils. They might have been quite heavy nitrogen users as dairy farmers, and over the last 10 years they've developed their soils to such a degree that they've got clovers and everything, and they don't need to do that. Is there any has there been any research on this sort of area?
I think it's emerging. I don't know any examples to quote, but it's certainly there's a growing movement of farmers in the UK who are using these practices, and the idea, and a lot of the nitrogen can come from the cover crops that are then incorporated back into the soil, and like you say, the use of legumes, but and as well as improving the soil structure, there is that's the way they don't have to add additional nitrogen. So, but I'm not aware of any publications.
No. I mean, some people might argue that, in fact, the reason they're getting so much extra grass growth is because their biological activity is working really well under the soil, and that's proof that if you can really get the biological activity going, that reaps loads of benefits. You don't need all these artificial inputs.
There is some evidence about phosphate. So if you improve the soil health, you can actually reduce the applications of phosphate. So you'll get target. You can use a target index of 1 rather than 2 if you've got good soil health. And the reason for that is that you're getting the nutrient recycling because of the better soil biological activity.
Yeah. Earlier on, there was a question. This is just to ask all speakers whether you've got bibliographies that you can recommend. And I don't know whether we're able to include, how we'd include that on this recording. But if you do, maybe you could send them to the PFLA office and we can see if we can do something with them. There's a question here, Kevin, for you from Paul Newell Price, who says he's sorry he missed the first part of your presentation, but how does the project plan to build on RB 209? Accounting for losses and nutrient supply from organic manure applications is already in RB 209 and based on research carried out over the past 40 years or so.
Yes, so there's an extensive literature, and the RB 209, if when you look at the website, there's a whole host of information there, and what we're trying to do is to make it more accessible. So we're taking these case studies related to the annual cycle that the farmers are undertaking, and homing in on nitrogen leaky points, and then we're harvesting information from RB 209 to, so it's all related to existing information. We're not regenerating information, so our guidance will very much reflect RB 209.
Great, thank you. There's a good question here from Frank Morby, who's involved with the Watch Tree Nature Reserve and a mass burial site near Carlisle. They've got 43 hectares which they manage as grassland, and they're trying to achieve diverse hay meadows and pasture on former agricultural lands and on the burial site, which is basically a badly disturbed clay mineral soil. His simple question is, if he takes soil samples, where does he look to go to for the best advice on how to manage the soils to improve the diversity? We're basically stuck with an NVC M10 community with little prospect of improvement, according to the Grassland Monitoring Surveyor. Whoever answers that question, could you please explain, because I don't know what it is, what an NVC M10 community is, please? Paul, you look as though you're about to answer it.
No, I was hoping to put myself on mute so I wouldn't have to answer that.
Well, I know what NVC stands for. Is it National Vegetation Community? So it's a type of community as defined by Rodwell, and you can look it up. But it's it's a particular assemblage of species.
So I suppose that, answering that question, I would say that you can get your soils tested and analysed by big labs, like NRM is one that's a nationwide lab that would test it for phosphorus, phosphate and nitrogen, and it comes back with magnesium. You could honestly look back at some of these webinars we've been doing on how to manage soils to improve diversity. We've had, this is the 6th, and probably 4 or 5 of the previous ones were all focusing on how to introduce diversity into your swards, and we've covered a range of sites, a range of scenarios, with farmers doing it through grazing management and haymaking, and then to small in town and city sites. So I would say that Plantlife is an organisation, I think that you give advice, don't you, on there's plenty of organisations out there who are really happy to advise on how to do this and link you up with other people who've already done it. A few years ago, Plantlife were running this amazing project in Kent, and I think some other areas, which was called Magnificent Meadows, and there was a real push to getting Meadows champions going who could offer advice on these things. So maybe the simple thing is to say, why don't you contact Plantlife?
Yeah, we're always very happy to help, and my colleague Isabel Hall is actually on the call as well, who is revitalising Magnificent Meadows and allowing it to move to the next step. So we are in the process of developing our Meadows hub, which would be able to provide additional information and direct people to the best information as it comes out. So we're very, very happy to help, and please reach out and we'll start a conversation.
I see it's 7 o'clock, Honor, but there's a couple of questions here which I just wanted to ask Paul, because they're actually not related to agriculture. So there's Chris Hogg has sent in a question saying, we've talked about nitrogen budgets in agriculture. How are golf courses, sports grounds covered in terms of sensitivities within catchments? Philippa might be able to answer that bit. And can Paul say something about which grass species might be used in sports pitches to try and get better root depth?
I think while we give Paul a moment to contemplate those answers, I am mindful that it's 7 o'clock and some people will be leaving. So I will say thank you very much to all of the panelists, and then we will be able to continue our conversation, and Paul will be able to answer those questions and any others. But we are very pleased that everyone was able to join us today, and the video will be on YouTube tomorrow, hopefully. So with that, I will allow the fun to continue and pass over to Paul to answer those questions.
Okay, I did notice there is a good answer to the MG10 grassland question on the chat. So I'll refer to that one for the person who had the question about that, because it is pretty much spot on. So with regards to the golf courses. So the question was about nitrogen use on golf courses. Despite the fact I've spent probably 15 years of my life as a caddy on a golf course staring at turf grass, I don't know a huge amount about management of turf. I was chatting with a local greenskeeper near us, and I was actually surprised at how little nitrogen they were using. Essentially, they were trying to moderate their nitrogen use because essentially the more nitrogen they put on, the more they had to mow the grass, which costs them money. So I was surprised at how little they were actually using. With regards to the environmental impact, again, grass is very efficient at taking up N. So I'm not sure whether it's always a negative environmental impact. There was another part to that question. I think it was species, turf grass species.
Yes, so it was actually, you could just talk about species generally, Paul, but it was specifically asking whether there were species that you'd put into a sports pitch situation in order to get better root depths. But I was just wondering whether there are some, just in general on grasslands, whether there are some really good native species with deep roots compared to others that you could recommend.
It's partly a species thing, but also within a species, there's a lot of variation. I just came across a reference today looking at perennial ryegrass and the fact that two different cultivars with similar yields actually had quite different root masses. So there doesn't seem to be the trade-off that you would think between root mass and above ground biomass. So there is a lot of promise to look within a species for variations in rooting depth and pattern, et cetera. And then certainly between species, there's quite a lot of differences in rooting depth. I know perennial ryegrass does have a reputation of being shallow rooted, partly a factor due to nutrient application. They tend to root where the nutrients are. So it's hard to separate genetic differences in rooting depth versus nutrient availability and the impact on rooting depth. Certainly, species such as, cocksfoot and tall fescue. They're quite robust grasses with quite deep rooting systems. Yeah, it's an interesting area of certainly one of the deepest, most intense root systems I've seen is on red fescue, which isn't always a quality forage, but it does seem to have a very dense, intense root system. Tall oak grass is another one that has a quite a robust, deep root system, and it's one we don't use in a lot of agricultural grasslands, but in Europe they do use it for hay meadow mixtures. And they also have a tall oak grass species rich mixture as well. So yeah, there's a lot of potential out there with different species for altering rooting depths. And the other thing that is an interesting area of research is compatibility with other plants. We've always bred our grasses in monocultures, and we haven't really selected for grasses that are actually compatible with other species. Is maybe a little bit done with perennial ryegrass, white clover, but I think that's more directed towards selecting white clover that's more competitive with ryegrass, as opposed to ryegrass that allows more white clover growth. So yeah, I think the direction of our plant grass breeding in particular has been to be responsive to fertilizer, to be very competitive and productive, not necessarily to be efficient with nutrient use and compatible with other species. So, and also diverse genotypes that are more resilient to climate change. We have a very strict DUS, distinct, uniform, and stable requirement for new cultivars, which means it's usually a very narrow genetic basis for a released cultivar, whereas natural grasslands have within a species a lot more genetic diversity.
Kevin or Philippa, did you want to say anything about that? Kevin, I was also wondering if before we finished, I know when we were discussing this webinar, you were keen to invite other farmers to join your project. Do you want to specifically do that call out to any farmers that are on the chat in your area?
Yeah, so a call to all farmers, if you want to get involved, then please get in touch with us as soon as you can. I think you can get my details through the PFLA, but I put it up on the slide. But we're particularly interested if you're if you're a more conventional farmer, or if you're looking at regenerative practices on your farm and you're looking to transition from conventional to more regenerative practices. We're very interested in that area, and we are actually undertaking a sort of questionnaire at the moment. We're a structured questionnaire with farmers, like an interview, where we really want to get to the bottom of how you're making your decisions about how you want to fertilize your crops and how you want to minimize use of fertilizers, perhaps. So yeah, please get in touch if you're interested in the project and would like to contribute or benefit from the guidance that we're producing.
There are probably a few questions still left behind, but oh, Kevin, here it says at the end, are you in touch with farm facilitation groups?
Not quite sure what you mean by farm facilitation groups, but we're is that a specific thing, Fidelity?
It's from Anne somebody. It's from Anne Cantrell. Yeah, she just says, are you in touch with farm facilitation groups?
Because we're working with farmer networks and advisors, but not farm facilitation groups per se. But
so facilitation groups are set up through countryside stewardship as a way of getting groups of farmers together to give them advice on specific things. If you've there's a list of them on .gov.uk, and maybe talk to Yorkshire Dales. They're involved in a few different facilitation groups up in Yorkshire to do with natural flood management and other water quality aspects.
Oh, thanks, Philippa. Yeah, and we're in touch with the catchment sensitive farming in Yorkshire as well, so we'll reach out to them. Thank you very much.
Great.
There's a nice message here just saying from somebody, thanks very much to all you panelists, excellent webinar. There's also a question about accessing the previous webinars. So the simplest way is for me to tell you that if you just Google PFLA YouTube channel and put in Plantlife after it, they'll all come up on that. So I do hope that I've sort of covered most of the questions, or anyway the areas, the topic areas. Just have one last look at the Q&A, and then I think it's probably oh, Glenn Boyd is asking, I don't know if this is another list that we can provide, a list of old cultivars or grass species that can be brought back into production again. Are they available anymore? Honor, is that something that Plantlife have lists of things like that?
I don't know, but I am happy to go away and investigate it. Perhaps if you're able to email me, I can track down the information and get back to you. And my email is honor.eldridge@plantlife.org.uk. Either email me directly, or I'm sure Fidelity is able to connect us otherwise.
Glenn, also just from the PFLA point of view, we have this amazing forum, which if you're a member, which costs £100, you could join and put out questions. And there have been over the years many questions on what are really good grasses to put into a new lay, particularly with a view to not using nitrogen and to having a wide range of grasses giving you a good long grazing season. So it's the sort of thing that organisations like the PFLA can also help answer. Not that we have that answer off the shelf, but within our membership we have an amazing lot of expertise and interest in these, and a lot of the species that Paul was talking about earlier are ones that people talk about wanting to try and get into their swards if they're reseeding. So Honor, it's over to you, I think, really.
Well, I think that we've had a fantastic discussion, and I covered a whole range of topics from nitrogen use efficiency all the way through to golf clubs, which is excellent. So I'm very pleased that so many were able to join us. I think our participants, I saw numbers getting up into the 200s while we were speaking. So that's really excellent, especially for a Tuesday evening with the sunshine. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you hugely to our panelists for their expertise. And as ever, thank you to the PFLA for coordinating this as well. It's a really fantastic partnership and a great excuse to get people together to share their expertise. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Honor.
Thanks, Anna.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.